Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It has just turned 7 o'clock, and I want to welcome you to the fourth of our 5 Science for Citizens presentations for spring 2021. My name is Tom Miller, and I have the honor and privilege of being the director here at the Chesapeake Biological Lab, part of the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science. And we put on these public seminars every year in 2 blocks, one in the spring and one in the autumn, to let the community know what we do and why it's important. These seminars have traditionally been conducted in person in one of our lecture halls here at CBL, and we certainly greatly miss the community spirit of getting together to hear a presenter and interact with one another. But the pandemic and the need to transition to a virtual presentation has allowed us to retain some of those long-serving attendees at these events, but also welcome some new people to our community. So if you are one of the new people joining our community, we offer you a heartfelt welcome and hope that you enjoy the presentation. These presentations, as I said, normally are done in person, and we thank the generosity of PNC Bank, Southern Maryland, Toyota, and Team Hyundai for hosting those events and providing our guests with refreshments and biscuits. Those companies obviously have no need to do that anymore because we're virtual, but all 3 companies have continued their support of these presentations throughout the last year, and we thank them for their generosity. As I said, this is the 4th of 5 presentations. This evening's presentation will be recorded, as all the others have been, and those are available on our Science for Citizens website. There are now over 55 presentations available, ranging from topics such as climate change and fisheries and ecological restoration, which is the topic of tonight's presentation. Our speaker tonight is Dr. Solange Filoso, a native of Brazil who did her original undergraduate work in Brazil, but she moved to the US to UC Santa Barbara for both a master's and a PhD. And then from there, her journey took her back to Brazil for a short period of time, to then the Ecosystem Science Center at the Marine Biological Lab in Woods Hole, finally to Cornell University, where she conducted postdoctoral work, and ultimately to us in Maryland, where she came to work with Margaret Palmer, who was my predecessor as director here at CBL. And Solange joined the CBL faculty in 2011 and has been conducting work on stream restoration here in Maryland, but also stream restoration back home in Brazil. And many of the principles that she learns are common to both categories of questions. Speaking of questions, if you have questions during tonight's presentation, please type them into the chat box, and I will moderate the questions at the end of the presentation, trying to group questions into themes, and I will pose your questions to tonight's speaker. So with that, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Solange Filoso, who will be talking about stream restoration. Is it helping our streams and the bay? Solange, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you everybody, the organizers, for the invitation, and thanks mainly also people that are joining us here for this presentation, virtual presentation. After 1 year of lockdown and COVID, it's not easy to be seeing virtual presentations, but in any case, so thank you. So the title of my talk is a question, and it is a tricky one, and I don't know if I'm going to have a satisfying answer, but that's what I hope to get to. At least I'd like you to all understand by the end of my talk why this is a tricky question, and it's complex, and I think that, you know, just to just to anticipate a little bit, I think the answer is yes and no. And I hope by the end of my talk, you understand why. So I'm trying to move here. Okay, so here's the outline of my talk today. As I said, my talk, what I'm going to try to explain to you is why this is a tricky question, and then hopefully provide you some answers. But to do that, I'm going to first talk about the importance of streams and why we restore them, because this is very important. A lot of times we don't know if restoration is effective or if it's helping, because we don't know even what we are asking them to do. We don't know why we're restoring them. And so there is always a mismatch between goals and expectations, and sometimes the goals are not even that clear. Then we'll move on to talk about stream restoration in the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And then I'll talk about the monitoring and evaluation that I have been doing for the past decade here in this region. And as Tom said, I also started doing some work in Brazil as well. And so talk about monitoring evaluation, the focus is going to be on water quality improvements and load reduction efficacy, but I'll also touch on a little bit on stream health, which is something that I've been getting into in the past year or so. And I have some cool data to show. So starting with the importance of streams and what we restore them, I'd like to first explain that the target of stream restoration is typically first, second, and third order channels, which form the majority of total stream length in any watershed. And so basically they are the foundation of our watersheds, and just just because of that, you can understand how important they are. So like here in the Bay, even though we have 50 major tributaries pouring water into the Bay every day, we need to remember that this water is coming in, a lot of this water is coming from these small channels, or at least passing through the small channels. So they are very important. In addition, they have very important functions. And here is a list of some that are considered really important. They regulate flow of water from the watershed. So as the water from the watershed moves to the drainage network, it goes through these tiny little channels, and just by sheer friction and resistance, the streams help regulate flow and control flood downstream. These channels also filter runoff, sediment, nutrients, and contaminants before they move further downstream. The streams also provide fish and wildlife habitat for breeding, feeding, and sheltering. And so overall, they also sustain the health of downstream rivers and bays, so like the Chesapeake Bay. So again, they are extremely important. At the same time, they are also very sensitive to environmental changes, because they have the impact of changes that are happening not only in their drainage area, in the watershed, but also they suffer the impact of regional or global change. Like, for example, climate change is known to change a precipitation regime, for example, or cause droughts, or whatever, and that affects flow of water in these channels and everything else, all the other functions that are linked to that. So they are very sensitive to environmental changes, and because of that, it's one of the most degraded ecosystems on Earth. And here is just I decided to put just a simple picture of a healthy versus a degraded stream. Unfortunately, a lot of streams in the world are looking much more like the stream here on the right. than on the left. And so while healthy streams are typically dynamic in terms of flow, and also complex in terms of habitat, they have pools and riffles and have riparian forests. They are also diverse in terms of biodiversity, typically have good water quality. And when they are degraded, they basically become a pipe, and an unstable pipe. Typically, the banks erode. They are homogeneous. You can see that you don't have the different habitats for fish and wildlife, low biodiversity, and low water quality. This is a problem, especially with very small streams. And so stream restoration, because of that stream restoration, because of degradation, widespread degradation all over the world, the stream restoration is increasingly being implemented. And so here is just a list of typical goals. The goals are to improve water quality, stream habitat, stabilize banks, control erosion, regulate or mitigate flow regime. There is a lot of restoration that is done for dam removal of dams, but in urban areas, a lot of restoration is done for implemented for stormflow management. And sometimes restoration is just done to protect infrastructure like sewage pipes or roads, or to create fish passage. And in terms of restoration approach, there is this restoration approach that is called natural channel design, which is the most common approach used not only here, but all over the world, or the US and the world. And the natural channel design is an approach where engineers and others attempt to transform a channel that is usually has become a pipe and is degraded, it is incised and straight, and they try to change to make it look more like a natural channel. And here are some of the techniques that are used. So a lot of times it's just increased sinuosity of the channel, or to protect the banks from erosion, implement ripraps. There are also some restoration that include flow deflectors to improve habitat or create habitat diversity, pool riffle complexes also for to improve habitat, and or regrading banks, and there are other things. But in general, this kind of restoration is, as I said, is just an attempt to change the stream to make it look more natural. And so it's very much focused on the channel form and not necessarily on the channel function, the functions that the channel has and provides. Here are just some pictures I thought would be interesting to show of a channel, a degraded channel here on the upper left, and then a restored channel on the lower right. And then the smaller pictures are just pictures of the construction phase. And you can see that the construction is, I mean, there is a lot of impact even in construction. And so there is a lot of concern about that as well. And so, as I said, stream restoration, I mean, this general, the natural channel design and the typical restoration goals are to make the channel look more natural and protect infrastructure or reduce erosion and things like that. But here in the Bay, here is an image that I thought was really cool, showing the export of sediments and nutrients from tributaries to the Bay, probably after a big storm event. But just to remind you, just to kind of highlight the problem that we have of excess nutrients and sediment that have degraded the bay water quality for decades. And with that, there was the establishment of this total maximum daily load, the TMDL, by the EPA, which is basically a prescription for a diet for the bay for the reduction of nutrients and sediments. So states and counties, municipalities, they're supposed to reduce how much of these pollutants they load into the tributaries that drain into the bay. And so basically now with the TMDL as a regulatory driver, a lot of the restoration projects, stream restoration projects that are implemented here in the Chesapeake Bay, they are focused on reducing pollutant loads to the bay, especially nitrogen, phosphorus, and suspended sediments. And so the main restoration goals in the bay right now are to reduce, as I said, to reduce pollutant loads to downstream waters, to meet TMDL goals usually, to improve water quality of streams, usually as part of a larger strategy to meet water quality standards for permitting requirements and also to meet TMDL goals. But we also have this goal that is clearly stated that we are supposed to improve the health of streams in general across the watershed. And the present goal right now is to improve the health of 900 miles of streams by 2025. However, because water quality is so important, there is a big preference or a bias, I would say, or actually it's a good thing for designs that reduce, that are, that are capable of reducing flow velocity, reduce peak flows, especially in urban areas, promote nutrient uptake, and reduce erosion and sediment export. And with that, there is a big push to restore functions, stream functions that have been lost, especially nutrient cycling capacity. So as nutrients, especially nitrogen and phosphorus, move downstream, there is a lot of retention and release, which slows down the transport of these nutrients downstream. But then when the stream is degraded and turns into a pipe, basically that nutrient cycling is lost. So the type of restoration that is preferred more and more in the bay watershed is the type that enhances nutrient cycling. Also that it reestablishes the balance in the sediment transport, so the stream is not exporting too much sediment and not retaining too much sediment, sorry. And also in the flow control, especially storm flow control, is an important aspect of restoration. And so in terms of design, again, the natural channel design is still highly it's widely used, but more and more this kind of design called regenerative stream conveyance system is used. And that's the kind of system that I have been studying because it is kind of novel. And there is the idea of this type of restoration, again, is to enhance nutrient uptake, sediment retention, but we didn't have any information until not too long ago about the performance of this type of restoration. And that's what I've been doing, monitoring these systems for the past few years. This regenerative stream channel, the conveyance channels, the techniques that they use, if they are implemented in lowland channels or channels that have gentle relief, usually include floodplain reconnection, creation of wetlands, and to create stream wetland complexes, again, with the hope or the idea that these wetlands or floodplains will enhance nutrient uptake and also retention of sediment. In some cases, these restorations include side storm flow ponds and or braided or side channels. Again, it's just to increase, the idea is to increase the water residence time and also the flow path of water in the channel to enhance, to create more and more opportunity for retention of or uptake of nutrients and retention of sediment. And so here are some pictures of these RSCs, we call them, in lowland channels. So on your left here, upper left, is a degraded channel before restoration, and the picture on the bottom of the screen on the left is also the degraded channel. In the middle, you see during construction phase, and on the right, you see the stream after restoration. And the restoration, again, this kind of restoration usually typically tries to widen the channel and to enhance or to reconnect the channel with the floodplain. And in this case, the floodplain had a lot of trees, so the trees will probably die. This is another example. So on the left is a channel before restoration. The middle is during the restoration construction, and on the right is the restoration, the restored stream, and which has been transformed in this case into what we call a stream wetland complex. So this stream has parts that is just a channel, but then it drains into a wetland and then again a channel, and then it goes like that, with the idea that that will enhance nutrient uptake and sediment retention. When this type of technique is implemented in upland channels or in steep channels, they are basically they consist of a series of step pools or they have step pool structures where usually there is a series of pools, so the water is pooled, especially during storm. I mean, a lot of these streams are not even perennial, so they collect storm water and then they treat. And the idea is that these step pools, they treat the storm water before it moves downstream into a perennial channel or into a tidal channel. And so these step pool structures, they usually have berms in between the pools, and these berms are made out of boulders, sand, but also wood chips and other organic matter material to promote microbial growth and hopefully uptake of nitrogen and other nutrients, so then they don't move downstream, to reduce loads. And here are some pictures of before and after restoration of one of these steep channels that I monitored. So on your left is a very highly eroded channel that comes from an outfall. I mean, a lot of these upland channels, they are eroded because of stormwater that is draining to them. And so the restoration approach is such that they, fill up this incised channel with material, sand and other materials that, that would enhance biogeochemical function and uptake of nutrients. And here on your right is the final product or the restored streams. But this is like in the early stages before vegetation grew and all that. And so now I'll go into the monitoring and evaluation of restoration. So this is, so this was just an introduction of the kind of systems that are out there. And as I said, I have been monitoring and evaluating the performance of these stream restoration projects for over a decade. And what I'm going to show here today to you is kind of a a synthesis of a lot of work that I have been doing. And so it looks like not a lot of data, but there is a lot of data in it. But anyway, so how do I determine restoration success regarding improvement of water quality and reduction of pollutant loads? So basically, just to simplify, what we do is we estimate contribution of base flow and storm flow to the annual discharge of the streams before and after restoration, but especially before restoration. So, we have the annual discharge, how much water that is conveyed in these streams. Part of this water comes from groundwater, so it's called base flow. So it's the normal flow, and storm flow is the flow that you see when during or after a storm event. And so there is a lot of surface runoff that is added to the stream flow. And so I measure water quantity to try to estimate how much of the flow is base flow that comes from groundwater and how much comes from stormwater. We also measure concentrations of pollutants, nitrogen, phosphorus, and total suspended solids in streams before and after restoration, during base flow and during storm flow. And then we calculate the loads and compare the loads before and after restoration to see if there is any significant difference. And if there is difference, it means that the restoration was a success in terms of reducing pollutant loads moving downstream. And here's a list of channels that I have monitored in this past years. Here's just a list of streams that have been monitored using comparable methods. And so these are the data from these streams that I have collected in these streams is what I have used to kind of put it all together and really, kind of try to answer this question if stream restoration is being effective at reducing loads of nutrients and sediment to downstream waters. And so again, I monitor about, the list includes about 10, it includes 10 channels. You can see that they have different drainage areas. Some are much bigger than others, some are very tiny. The tiny ones are usually the ones that are in the very top of the watershed with very small catchments, so first order streams. They have different levels of imperviousness. Some are over 50% impervious. And they, as I said, they are positioned in different parts of the watershed, either in their lowland channels or they are headwater in the sense that they are, up in the upland. But most of the channels that I have, the projects that I have monitored so far are in the coastal plain. There is just one that I have monitored so far in the Piedmont. So here is just a drawing of what, to illustrate what I mean about streams that are up in the watershed or low in the watershed. So most of the channels that are high in the watershed, they are headwater gully channels. And then in the bottom of the watershed, they are lowland alluvial channels. And in terms of how the monitoring is done, for water quality, what I did is like sampled, collected water samples in these channels during normal flow conditions or base flow and during storm flow conditions. So during base flow, we would go every 2 weeks and collect samples manually and then filter and then analyze them in the lab. But for storm flow, it was a little bit more complicated because we collected samples along entire hydrographs, meaning from the beginning of a storm when the water level is still normal, and then as it continued to collect water samples as the water level goes up and then goes down to kind of to have an idea of how concentrations change during this entire time, and to then calculate loads properly. And so this type of storm flow sample collection was done throughout the year. And every time that samples were, that storm flow samples were collected, we generated about 24 samples or more. And we collected several storms per season, and in a pre-restored and restored control site. So we can just imagine the number of samples generated for analysis each time that we went out sampling. For water quantity, the monitoring included measuring how much rain, how much water was collected, how much rain fell into each catchment that had the stream to be restored or that was restored. And in the channel, we measured instant flow manually with some methods that provided by the USGS, but also we used structures like flumes and weirs for to have better measurements. And so now I'm going to just, start showing some data, so then you have an idea, just to explain what we have learned so far. So first of all, what we have learned is that out of these 10 channels that I am summarizing the data for, is that the majority of the channels that I have monitored, in the past decade, what we have learned is that the majority of the annual discharge of these channels is from storm flow. So storm flow contributes way over 50%, except for one channel here, over 50% of the annual discharge. So it's very important. So it means that if the stream restoration helps improve the water quality during storm flow, that's a good sign. But base flow is when there is a lot of biological activity, so that's also important. So what we have, so here's some data for concentrations, and again, this is just a summary of concentrations of all the streams that I have monitored for all the years before and after restoration during base flow here. And I'm just showing you data for total nitrogen concentration here, concentration in milligrams per liter, because we just saw a reduction in concentrations during base flow conditions or normal low flow conditions only for total nitrogen. Concentrations for phosphorus and sediment actually either didn't decrease or increase with restoration. So restoration did not help improve water quality during normal flow conditions, except for some reduction in total nitrogen concentration. Okay, and I'll talk about, I'll show what this means later. For storm flow, during storm flow, when, during or after a rain, concentrations decreased, concentrations for nitrogen, phosphorus, and total spent solid decreased in the restored stream. So we saw, a substantial decrease in concentrations, especially for total suspended solids. So meaning that restoration was highly effective at improving water quality during storm flow conditions, not so much for base flow conditions. The storm flow conditions, this is important is that because the majority of the discharge, the most of the water that is discharged annually downstream from these channels is from storm flow. This improvement in water quality for storm flow reflected on a reduction of loads. And so what we saw here, so these charts here show changes in loads after restoration in terms of percentage. So going from 0 to 100% in the different channels. So in the upper panel here, you see for total nitrogen that all the channels reduce loads of nitrogen, some better than others. up to 60%, some less than 20%. For total phosphorus and total suspended solid, there were some channels that reduced loads by almost 90% or more, while other channels actually increased loads. So bars that go to the left indicate that there was an increase in loads after restoration. So some streams didn't perform well or actually created more problem, increased loads going downstream rather than decreasing. So no performance. But what we saw, what is interesting is that the ones that performed well were all first order channels in the upland channels in the very top of the watershed that had those step pools kind of restoration. And so they, except for one of them, there was like a different type of restoration, but the location, the position of the restoration, the stream in the watershed seemed to be relevant to performance. Another thing that we saw is that that another potential factor that seems to be limiting restoration performance, because we're interested in kind of helping also regulators or watershed managers to kind of decide what kind of restoration they should invest on, and have some kind of easy indicators for them. And so we saw that there was a decrease in the performance. So this again is like percent change, meaning how much load reduction there was in the restored stream. These points are all different streams, and how much reduction there was in relation to the level of imperviousness in the watershed. And so what we saw is that the more impervious the watershed or the catchment area was for the streams, the lower the performance, or the less pollutant reduction there was. In fact, in some cases, as I said, there was actually an increase in pollutant in pollutant loads. So imperviousness is a very easy indicator, and it's interesting because there are also some studies here from UNCIS with macroinvertebrates that show that imperviousness also impairs the recovery or the biological uplift in terms of the microinvertebrates in streams coming back after restoration. And so I guess that, so what we saw is that these streams, the restoration seems to be not improving water quality all the time, but because the restoration is reducing, they're improving water quality during storm flow conditions, that they are performing well. So they are actually being effective at reducing loads to the bay. So restoration success is high. There are some that don't do as well. There is variability, but there is success too. But then there is the question about stream health. Aren't we supposed to improve stream health? And so this is something that I have been wanting to look at for a long time. I mean, unfortunately, all the funding that was available until not too long ago was just to look at water quality and load reduction. But I was always curious about stream health. And so just in the past year or so, I have started looking into, using indicators of stream health to look at whether or not restoration is also helping the stream. So not only the bay, but the streams. And so the indicators that I used, and this is like a project that I have done in collaboration with a colleague here from CBL, Ryan Woodland. And so what indicators that the indicators we used included oxygen concentration, dissolved oxygen concentration, which is an indicator of the ability of the system to support aquatic life. We also looked into stream metabolism, which is it's a very general but a very good indicator of stream health, highly used. It's a metric that it helps explain how much biotic activity there is in a stream. So while also hinting at water quality. So it basically it tells you how much production there is, primary production there is in a stream versus respiration. It's just like for us when we go to the doctor, for a checkup, the doctor looks at our blood, that we can do blood tests and these. So these are just like, to use as indicators to see how our health is doing. And stream metabolism is a kind of indicator of stream health, just to give you an idea. And then another indicator was fish index of biotic integrity, which is a well-known and accepted indicator of stream condition. So the question is, are fish populations coming back with restoration? Is the diversity of the fish community better? And so this is what this indicator can help with. And then the streams that we monitor for that, we surveyed up to 30 streams, and here is what they look like. We surveyed minimally disturbed streams that were single channel or had were connected to the floodplain or had wetlands. We also surveyed degraded streams, and then the restored streams that have been restored with the regenerative stream channel design. And I'm almost done, but here what we have found is that, so here is a plot of dissolved oxygen concentrations. In the blue bar represents the stream, the single channel minimally disturbed. The orange is also a group of streams that is minimally disturbed. The gray represents degraded streams, a group of streams that have been degraded, and the yellow here, a group of streams that have been restored using the regenerative stream conveyance design. And so these are box plots showing the medium concentrations of dissolved dissolved oxygen concentrations. And what we see is that the restored stream, the concentrations in restored streams were very variable. Again, this is just like I just put all the data together, but what we saw is that there was a lot of variability during the summer and fall in terms of DO concentrations. Sometimes concentrations went way down below 1 milligram per liter. But I just want to say that fish and other creatures, they have different tolerance range for dissolved oxygen concentrations. But when levels go below 3 milligrams per liter, which you see here, the mark with this, the red line, it is concerning because some species may not be tolerant to such low species. So it means that restoration may be, this kind of restoration design that is the restoration that is designed to enhance uptake of nutrients and slow down the water to increase opportunity for nutrient uptake may have a toll on dissolved or oxygen concentrations and a toll on the organisms living in the channel. In terms of stream metabolism, again, the metabolism is just a way to look at how the system is doing in terms of like how much it's producing versus respiring. And what we have seen, so I'm still putting together data, and so I don't have yet the data for the control sites or the reference sites. But so far, what we have seen is that the primary production in these streams was lower than respiration. So respiration is greater than production in these restored streams, meaning that the ecosystem is using more energy that it's creating. And this is also when you have something like this, when the primary productivity is lower than respiration, it's an indication of water pollution. So we may be restoring the streams and, you know, trying to enhance nutrient uptake and all that, but the truth is that we are not reducing the amount of nutrients that is coming into the stream, so the water is still highly polluted or full of nutrients, and so you know, this may be a problem. And here's the last slide showing a figure of a plot of this fish index of biotic integrity, and the bars here on the left indicate high quality streams, the reference streams, and the two on the right indicate degraded and restored stream. And again, we see that the threshold for impairment also is at level 3. I mean, this is not my area of expertise, but I thought it would be interesting to show. But basically what this shows is that the restored stream is still below the threshold for impairment. So we haven't seen much improvement in terms of fish diversity and other important indicators. So you know, this is a concern, but maybe it's just a matter of time. Maybe it will take decades for the systems to go back to a more normal level, or maybe it is a matter of really eliminating or reducing the source of stress to the systems, like too much nutrients coming in, or too much surface runoff or whatever. But in conclusion, going back to the question that we started with, is stream restoration helping our streams and the bay? So my answer is that stream restoration is helping the bay, but not necessarily the streams. It's helping, but still, I mean, this is also have to be careful, because we need way more restoration to really have an impact at the bay, at the scale of the bay. But, you know, having a little bit is better than nothing. Another thing, another conclusion is that we need to pay more attention to where we restore streams. We saw that streams performed much better if they were restored, I mean, at the top of the watershed, so upland streams. And we also need to pay more attention to trade-offs. So maybe we're enhancing nutrient uptake, but at the cost of reducing oxygen levels in the streams, and then causing some harm to organisms like fish and macroinvertebrates. And another thing is that maybe this is all a matter of like waiting long enough, as I said, for these systems to recover. So it is very important that we monitor changes for a long time, which is something that we don't do right now, unfortunately. And just the last slide here, I just want to say that in the area of stream restoration ecology, restoration ecologists say that restoration, what it is, the ultimate goal of restoration should be to move a degraded ecosystem to a trajectory of recovery. So we need to help the system recover, but we need to take into account local and global environmental changes. So we can't be too naive to think that we can bring the system to a totally natural state again, but we need to do things like to improve, to help the system improve or recover processes that will help in this trajectory of recovery. So with that, thank you, and I will take questions.
Thank you, Solange. I think you'll be surprised by the specificity of some of the questions you're about to get. So I'll start with a very general one. And it was from, sorry, people are asking questions and I'm moving up, from Jim Hurley. And he says, who is responsible for stream restoration? Is it a local activity, a state, or some agency in between?
Very good question. So it varies. There is some restoration. A lot of restoration is done by nonprofit organizations or by river keepers, I mean, communities, but more and more by municipalities, by government, state and municipalities, especially because of the TMDLs. And so because, I think after 2015, stream restoration started being considered one of the practices that can be used to reduce pollutant loads or nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment loads to the bay. And so I think that a lot of governments end up using stream restoration as a way to kind of address the problem, hoping that they don't have to do anything else in the watershed. That's the problem.
Right. So sort of somewhat related from Shahadi T, who says, have you considered dam removals as restorations in your research? They seem to fit into your regenerative stream conveyance system ideas.
Yeah, I'd love to, and I may do that in Brazil, where a lot of the rivers have been impounded and dammed because most of the energy there is hydroelectric. But in any case, there is a lot of dam removal and actually monitoring here in the US. What is interesting is that while we are doing restoration, like reestablishing normal flow, in the streams by removing dams all over the country, here we seem to be going more towards impounding streams to enhance nutrient uptake and everything. We don't call them dams, but they are kind of little, tiny dams. And so it will be interesting to compare, eventually how removing these impoundments would lead to, in terms of biological uplift in these systems versus impounding. So it's a good question, but we don't have the opportunity here. At least I don't, not at these headwater channels.
Thank you, Solange. Another question, getting a little more specific, from John Burwell. Have studies been performed monitoring macroinvertebrate diversity and other aquatic life before and after restoration?
There have been studies, not before. I mean, I think just recently there have been studies comparing restored streams with non-restored, but unfortunately, a lot of the times the studies were carried out after restoration. So the control site, the non-restored before restoration, was typically upstream of the restoration, or some kind of a control site of a stream nearby that it had similar catchment. And that's a problem because ideally we would know what is really happening if we, and this is a problem also with water quality monitoring, but it's hard to really determine what restoration is doing if we don't monitor before restoration. And but there are studies. Actually, there is one colleague here from UMSIS, from the Appalachian Lab, that has been doing a lot, or has done a lot of these macroinvertebrates studies. Hildebrand is his last name.
All right, thank you. So even though streams with a greater amount of imperviousness in the watershed were less responsive to restoration, how did the absolute amount of nitrogen or phosphorus or total suspended solids reduction compare?
I don't know if I understand the question, but maybe is that like how well they do in comparison to the restored streams that don't have a lot of impervious?
No, I think it's more. I think it's more to do with the fact that you talked about proportional declines in N and P and total suspended solids, and it gets to the point of, I think implicit in this is streams with greater amount of imperviousness may well be bigger, or so even though they responded less, the total amount of nitrogen or phosphorus removed was still higher.
Yeah. Very, there is a lot of debate about that. It's a very good point, because even though these larger channels that drain larger watersheds are not performing as well, if you consider how much they are, the total amount of pollutants that they are removing or reducing is, it's way more than tiny channels that perform well. The problem is, so I have a lot of discussion about that with watershed managers, because the tendency of managers is to go for larger channels and restore them, because you basically, even if they are not they don't have the highest performance, they remove a lot, and that's what they want. The problem is that I believe that if you don't eliminate it, a lot of the problem in these channels comes from upstream. And so eventually, even the restoration, even if it's, the restored stream, these larger streams are doing well, eventually they are not going to do well, because you're not removing, or at least reducing, the source of impairment, or or the source of pollutants. So it's a debate, but the thing is that, what I understand, I don't blame anybody, because there is money for restoration. People, these managers have to make quick decisions. The money comes and goes, and sometimes it's easier just to reduce the maximum amount possible in the lower channel, instead of going to tiny little channels all over the place, get permissions and all that, in order to guarantee that you have 50% or more reduction, or higher performance. I would prefer to go that way, but it's not the practical thing. And that's what we have to take into consideration too.
Thank you, Solange. That was Sally Horner's question, by the way. And Sally, I hope I phrased it correctly.
Yeah.
So Jack Templeton says, if reduced stream velocities of regenerative streams contributes to lower dissolved oxygens, might increased turbulence caused by rock ripples placed in the stream improve the oxygen levels?
Yes, yeah, it helps, because oxygen in the streams comes from the atmosphere and from primary production. And so if you help aerate the streams, it helps. The method that we have been using to measure oxygen, though, and look at metabolism, is such that we try to use this integration method, where we try to go downstream of the restoration, the end of the restoration, in an area that is not stagnant, to kind of try to determine, to pick up the whole, what is happening in the whole channel. But it's still, there's a lot of spatial variability and temporal variability, and that's why the best thing to do is just to have this kind of monitoring for many years. And actually, I think that the USGS is now doing this kind of, or promoting this kind of monitoring, long-term monitoring of dissolved oxygen in streams, because of that.
That answer, in a sense, Solange, gets to Tom Fisher's question that says it seems that streams will require years to recover from reconstructive surgery. I love that phrase, reconstructive surgery. Do you have enough data to see long-term recovery?
Yeah, very good question. And I do actually have data. I monitored some of the streams that I included in the list there. I monitor right after restoration, because that's when the funding was available for monitoring, and the performance was really bad. But I just, from looking and being there during construction, during the reconstructive surgery phase, we could see that there was a lot of impact. And so then I got funding to monitor the systems 2 years later, 3 years later, and they were doing better. So I do think that they will recover, they will improve, but you have to also take into account further development or whatever in the watershed, and sometimes that will kind of throw everything back.
Okay, so one last question, and I apologize to the questioner because her surname is cut off on my screen. So I have Alexei Sanchez, but I know there's something after that. I just can't see it on my screen. It's shortened. So Alexei asks, is the high respiration in RSC streams due to the organic material added to the RSC?
I don't know. What I think, I mean, so far we have monitored these systems during the spring, I mean the summer, and then fall, early fall. And I think that the high respiration is because these RSCs, usually they widen channels, and there is a lot of light incidence, and at the same time, nutrient concentrations are still high. So there is a lot of primary production from algae, you know, it's like this easy to eat or to degrade material. So very labile material. And I think that, and so you have this, you know, like during the growing season, there is all this vegetation and everything that grows there. I mean, it's just like unbelievably productive. And then everything kind of, you know, dies off, or during the night too, when there is no production of oxygen, the dissolved oxygen concentrations go down. So I think it's just like all this vegetation and stuff that grows there because of light incidence and low velocity flow.
All right, I promised you that was the last question, but I've seen one other that I think has to be asked, and it reflects how I'm always impressed by how well our audience thinks. And this is from Rob Schnabel, who says, did any of these projects focus on the source of the problem, say upstream stormwater management? And if so, how did they impact the pollution removal, DO, and water temperature? So it's sort of a question, do you restore the stream or do you stop the upstream problem?
Yeah. No, I totally am a firm believer that you need to, I mean, I think that we need to do restoration because the streams are degraded and they need to be restored. But I think that we have to also couple restoration with implementation of measures in the catchment. So I always say that we need to think outside of the stream, of the channel. In fact, I have some data from one project that there was restoration in the channel and some stormwater BMPs implemented in the catchment, and the stormwater BMPs performed amazingly well. They reduced much more nitrogen than the stream itself. And so just to show, I mean, they can really help. So I think in conjunction, restoration with BMPs in the catchment is the way to go. But I think we need to first look at what can be done in the catchment. And I think that stream, you know, making the analogy of restoration being some kind of surgery, like Tom Fisher said, you know, should be the last resort, you know, and we sometimes go to that first because, and it's not anybody's fault, it's just because it's what is practical. It's hard. I hear that it's hard to get permits to do things in people's properties and all that. And so it's not easy, but that's where we should go though.
All right. Well, Solange, we will make that the last question. I want to thank you very, very much for your time. To those who asked questions wanting to contact Solange, if you contact the person who sent you the email, Sarah Brzezinski, she can put you in touch with Solange. Next week, sort of building off of that last question, one of our other faculty members, Dr. Lisa Wanger, will bring the economic argument into this discussion, not focusing specifically on stream restoration, but more on land use and restoration activities in general, and ask, are there win-win circumstances, if you like, where restoration activities can benefit both the landowner, whether that's agriculture or state or private lands, and the cleaning of the bay as well. And so I encourage you all to join us next Tuesday for the last one of this session. I thank you all for spending your time on what was a momentous day in this nation's history. So I appreciate you taking time out to spend it with us. And we look forward to seeing all of you next week. And Solange, thank you very much again. Thank you.
Thank you.